Welcome to the Love Your Story podcast. I'm your host, Lori Lee, and you are here today for a quick chat that is one great inspirational idea in 15 minutes or less. Today's show is called Small Steps, Big Wins. That's what we're talking about. So stay tuned for this quickie discussion with Sue Saller. Host, Sue, is it Saller? Saller.
Saller.
Saller. I always get it wrong. I apologize. She's the host of the Small Steps, Big Wins podcast, and we're going to explore this idea of giving yourself a break because, as Van Gogh said, quote, great things are done by a series of small things brought together, unquote. Stories are our lives in language. Welcome to the Love Your Story podcast. I'm Lori Lee, and I'm excited for our future together of telling stories, evaluating our own stories, and lifting ourselves and others to greater places because of our control over our stories. This podcast is about empowerment and giving you, the listener, ideas to work with in making your stories work for you. Story power serves you best when you know how to use it. I'm Lori Lee.
And I'm Sue Saller. Welcome.
Hi, Sue. Tell us a little about yourself.
I'm from South Carolina, and I have a podcast called Small Steps, Big Wins podcast.
So she talks with people about stuff like this all the time. So, Sue, I wanted to start this out with, so the other day I was doing this service project, and I was writing letters to young people who are out in the world, spreading the message and the testimony of Christ. And as I was writing the letters, the message that kept coming to me that I needed to share was for them not to get discouraged, to get up every day and to have happy conversations with people and to share their smile and to share their testimony, to share their love, and that all these small and simple things add up. And even when you don't see the impact, you get up and you do it again the next day. So then I'm driving home after I was doing this, and I just felt like all of a sudden the thought came to me, you need to apply this to yourself too, because I'd been thinking about the podcast and thinking about, what to do for 2024. And, I, as a podcaster, and you'll know this, you don't always know who's listening to your podcast, and you don't know who's feeling inspired, and you don't know the impact that it makes. You're throwing this pebble into the lake, and there's a ton of ripples. You can see what your downloads are. You can see how many people listen, but you don't know what impact it makes. So you just keep getting up. And that's what I was feeling. Like, you get up every day, you be a friend, you get great interviews, you work hard at what you're doing, you send cards, you love your kids, you make time with your husband, and each of these things add up. You're investing your time. And even though they're small steps, they're bringing the really big wins of life, because nothing big was created without a whole bunch of small steps bringing it together. And this is what you talk to people about all the time, right?
Yep, we do. We do. And what I love about what you just shared, Lori, is that we sometimes minimize small steps. Like, we just kind of cast them on the side and think they're really not that important. But really, life is made in the small steps.
Yes.
And part of my podcast, and part of my podcast is talking to people who have done micro actions that have led to big results. And, and I think the other point you said is sometimes we don't always know the reach that we make in the day-to-day and in those small steps that we take. And I think we forget that that's okay. We forget that we don't always have to see big results all the time. We love big results, but as you said, just show up and just do.
We were down in Santiago, Chile on a bus, and we were talking to the guide. And when he heard we were from Utah, he said, "Oh, are you guys LDS?" That's the Mormon church out here, the Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we said, yes. And he said, "Oh, I was talking with some missionaries the other day. Their names were Elder." And he had all this super positive conversation with them. And so he was sharing that with everybody that was on the bus. And he said, "This is the only conversation I will ever have about God." Like that 30 minutes I talked with the missionaries was the only time that I've ever talked about God in my life. And I feel like that was a really positive thing for him. And he shared it in a positive way. But I guarantee you those 20-year-old missionaries that were out there talking with him had just had a conversation with him and had no idea that it had been a positive thing, or that he would share it with, 50 people on a bus a couple years later in a positive way. It's just stuff like that, stuff.
Yeah, we have no idea what our small steps are going to do. Yeah, no idea at all, like where they're going to head. And I think sometimes people don't want to take those small steps because they have a big win, a big goal in mind, and they're afraid to take the small steps because they don't know all the steps in between. And what I really want to encourage people, especially from the stories that I've heard, is that most of those people that have accomplished something that we would consider big started with small steps, but they only knew or only saw one or two steps in the beginning. Yeah, when you're going into the dark and you've got the flashlight in front of you, right? The flashlight, you can only see so many feet in front of you. You're headed somewhere. You're walking down the street. You've got a distance you have to go, but you don't always see it. And I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, and that's kind of like the life of an entrepreneur. You're headed in a direction. There's somewhere you want to go, but you only have a couple steps in front of you. And it's taking those small steps that will eventually lead to a big win. And big wins, the other thing I found is that a big win is defined differently for everybody. So what looks like a big win for me might not be a big win for you, might be a small win to somebody else. So I think we have to be really careful when we say, oh, that's just a small step that I took, or that's just or that they did a really big win and I only had a small step. I think we need to be really careful with how we're comparing ourselves to others. I always try and encourage somebody, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not who somebody else is. And are you in a different place today than you were yesterday? Yeah. Well, then you took some small steps that led to your big win for that day.
Awesome. One of the sayings I really like is that lives are transformed one decision and one conversation at a time. Back to your point of life is just made up of small steps. We, as people, sometimes a big job gets overwhelming. So, it's like, oh, this is a huge thing that I have to do. I don't dare. It's too big. It's overwhelming. So this idea of time blocking is something that we use in the 21 challenges, where you just work on something for 20 minutes and then you let it go for the day. And then you come back and work on it for another 20 minutes the next day, right? It's like that eating the elephant. You just do it one bite at a time, and all those little small steps. In the end, the elephant's gone. You've accomplished the thing, but it hasn't overwhelmed you.
Right. I can't say better than that.
Well, you have clients.
That's like that. It says micro steps. Yeah, it says micro steps that move the needle forward 1% each day, And so, like you said, to put 20 minutes in, if there's something you want to accomplish, then try and work backwards. It's like, I need to do this.
Reverse engineer.
Yeah. Oh, and reverse engineer it. Absolutely. And the other thing I found is if you're having trouble reverse engineering it, then find a who to help you do the how, and reach out to somebody who has done that thing before and find out what their first steps were. And a lot of times you can work from that as well. If you're just not quite sure where to start, because I think sometimes we get paralyzed, we can have analysis paralysis. It's like, oh, I want that thing, but I don't know how to quite get there. And we forget that there's probably somebody out there who has done that before. Yeah. I did it with my podcast. I Googled, how do I start a podcast? Now you have ChatGPT. So ChatGPT will tell you about 98% of what to do and where to go, so there's so much information out there that, we can get started, but there's also the human component as well.
Well, I want to get specific with the story first before we tie up. Share with me one of your clients that, what does it look like when somebody you've interviewed, like how did the tiny steps add up to a big win?
Yeah. So I had a client who his small step actually was volunteering for an event to run the tech team. And he worked behind the scenes, almost like a water boy, so sort of, but, on the tech team running stuff for them. And then he just continued to show up at these different events and just volunteered his time. But in his process of volunteering, he got noticed by some of the presenters and speakers that were there. So they start striking up conversations. And these were pretty well-to-do people, but they needed help and they saw something in him as he kept showing up, just kept doing these things. And as he did that, and this is over a time frame of, I would say, at least a decade. But to fast forward to the end, he now is CEO for one of the companies of one of the people that he met just from volunteering many, many years ago. Now, there's a lot of small steps in between, but there's a lot of big steps in between. But the point was he showed up, he volunteered. What seemed like a small thing for him to do actually led to a big result over time.
Oh, that's great. And we live in a society right now where there's so much instant gratification that oftentimes people just want to jump from, I have this idea, to it's completed. And I think it's really important just to note, this is real life, and getting something done, accomplishing something that's worthwhile takes steps. And often those steps are hard, but they don't have to be big. You're not going to jump from A to Z, but you are going to take the step A to B to C to D, and know that you're going to do that. You don't have to know what the steps are necessarily, like we talked about, but you know that you're going to have to take those steps to create something. Don't be afraid of those. Just be prepared. Any final thoughts, Sue, before we wrap up? I'm really trying to stick to this under 15 minutes thing. So I've got the
final my final thought to everybody is your first real step. The first small step is to believe that you can. So believe in yourself that you can accomplish that thing and start there. And even if you don't know the steps, throw it out there. They will come to you, but believe that you can do that. And if you can't believe or you don't believe in yourself to do it, find somebody who does believe in you and borrow their belief. So borrow their belief. You're welcome.
Do that, and then make sure that you keep showing up. Make sure that you just look for one step ahead. You can break it down. Like we've talked about some good things here. Sue, the host of the Small Steps, Big Wins podcast, you can listen to her show, and you are doing bigger things than you know by small and simple steps. And remember, keep doing those small and simple steps. So hit up the Love Your Story podcast website at loveyourstorypodcast.com, and you can leave me a voicemail. There's a graphic of a little microphone in the bottom of the homepage, so you can click on that and leave me a message. We can start talking. So have a great week, living your life with intention and recognizing all those small steps that you're taking. If you keep taking the steps, you're going to get to the end. It's like being on a trail, right? Like you want to hike from point A to point Z, you are going to get on the trail and you're just going to take all the steps and you're going to get there. So everything's possible. Right. Yeah?
That's right. That's right. And you don't always have to have the steps. You just have to take the first one.
Thanks for being here today, guys.